Welcome to the deep dive. So today we are looking at um, one of the most remarkable primary sources I think we've ever encountered.
It's incredible. It's Frankie Denson's personal hand-compiled scrapbook.
And this isn't just a dry collection of facts. It feels like a living ledger of this one small town, Fountain Hill, Arkansas.
Exactly. I mean, when you open this scrapbook, you're not just reading names, you're meeting what Denson himself called a polygenetic community.
Polygenetic. I like that. It's this whole mix of people.
It is. It's a tapestry, of survivors, hustlers, even governors and heroes.
Hmm.
And our whole mission here is to give you a shortcut, a way to get deeply informed about the massive and often contradictory history packed into this one small town.
Well, before we even get into the town's history, we really have to talk about the man who saved it. I mean, the story of Frank Denson himself it's the foundation for everything else.
It's the core of the whole project, yeah. He was drafted into this role as historian back in 1998.
And he says it was through misunderstanding.
That's how he puts it, yeah. A misunderstanding at an alumni banquet. He started with this, noble but very specific goal. Just document the school's history.
But the school itself wasn't exactly helpful.
Not at all. The institutional support you'd expect just wasn't there. He asked for materials, names of graduates, things like that, and got nothing back.
He was even denied permission to copy a photo.
Right. An important foundational photograph. And his letters, they just went unacknowledged, ignored.
So the physical stuff he did manage to find must have been a gold mine then.
You'd think so, but no, it was a disaster. The yearbooks he could get his hands on were, in his own words, cut, torn, scribbled on, and in very poor condition, basically worthless.
So all that resistance, the neglect, it kind of forced his hand.
It did. It forced him to broaden his scope. He realized, if he couldn't get the neat official history of the school, he'd just document the entire community instead.
Which, in the end, gave us something so much richer.
Infinitely richer. And he was doing all of this while facing this huge personal battle.
Multiple sclerosis.
Right. And he wrote about it. He described it as a hardening of the tissue in the nervous system. I mean, you know what that leads to. Paralysis, speech problems, loss of vision.
And he knew it. He was working against a ticking clock.
A very real one. He mentioned that the last year had been incredibly hard on his health and that he had an eye operation scheduled. This wasn't a hobby for him. This was a race to get this history down before the disease took away his ability to do it.
And this is where the story becomes almost cinematic. He wasn't doing it alone.
No, and thank goodness for that. The power of friendship, really. He reached out to his friend, Leroy Deckelman.
And Deckelman didn't just offer to help proofread.
Not at all. He became the physical muscle of the whole operation. He helped edit, he helped structure the scrapbook, but he also did something legendary.
The story about the school wall.
Yeah. So after all that, they still didn't have the names of graduates from the last 9 years. The school just wouldn't provide them.
So what do they do?
Deckelman literally scaled the walls of the school building.
You're kidding me.
I'm not. He climbed the wall to find the names, and Denson, the man with MS, was on the ground, holding the ladder steady for him.
Wow. Just think about that image. One man fighting this disease, holding a ladder for his friend who's risking his own neck just to get a list of names.
Names the school itself didn't seem to care about. It's the perfect metaphor for the whole project, isn't it? Two friends making sure their neighbors didn't just fade away.
That spirit, that determination, really sets the stage for everything we're about to talk about.
It really does. Okay, so let's dive in. Let's start at the very beginning with segment 1, the mythic founders and the deep roots of Fountain Hill.
And that means we have to start with the patriarch himself, the man who gave the town its name, Isaac Denson.
Right. He was born way back in 1794 in North Carolina. That's the same year as the Whiskey Rebellion, to give you some context.
And he doesn't arrive in Arkansas until 1842, when he's already 48. He came with his brother, Thomas.
And Isaac quickly makes a name for himself. He gets this local nickname, the Hustler.
Which today might sound a little shady.
It might, but back then on the frontier, it was a compliment. It meant he was prosperous, energetic, someone who got things done.
And he had a background that suggested he was a leader. He was a veteran of the War of 1812.
And not just any soldier. The source says he served as a lifeguard for General Cleburne.
A lifeguard.
A bodyguard, essentially, a position of trust, right next to a person in power. So he arrives with this built-in credibility.
And he puts his stamp on the place immediately. He names the town Fountain Hill after his birthplace.
And he becomes central to its social structure, too. He was the first clerk of the Flat Creek Baptist Church from 1845 to 1848.
And in those early days, the church wasn't just for Sunday service. It was almost a form of government.
It was the primary mediator for pretty much any dispute. Which brings us to this fantastic story about Isaac Denson and his neighbor, Archibald McCall.
A story about hogs.
A story about hogs. McCall's hogs kept getting into Denson's property or his habitation, and this wasn't just a neighborly spat. The church conference got involved.
So they took it that seriously.
Oh, yeah. They accused both men of conduct that was against the letter of the moral law and the peace and harmony of the church and neighborhood. They saw it as a spiritual crisis.
So instead of going to a courthouse, which probably didn't even exist yet, they turned to the church.
Exactly. The church leadership declared a time of fasting and prayer to solve the hog problem.
Fasting and prayer over pigs. I love it.
And it worked. The church eventually told McCall to get his hogs, calling their presence an imposition on Denson. So you can see, moral law, as decided by the church, was the law.
And Isaac Denson's own property became the physical center for the formal law, too.
Right. When Ashley County was formed in 1848, the legislature officially named Denson's house as the first courthouse.
And what did he get paid for that?
The grand sum of $5 per session.
So let's picture this scene. The source gives us some great details. It's a house with a big porch, a railing, and a mulberry tree right nearby.
The perfect stage for the story of the distracted judge.
Right. So an attorney is in the middle of this very elaborate, detailed argument in front of the county's first judge, Judge Willis.
And this is where the frontier reality just completely crashes the party. The judge gets totally mesmerized by a red-headed woodpecker.
A woodpecker.
This bird is flying back and forth from the mulberry tree, grabbing fruit and taking it to an old pine snag. And the source says the judge became so absorbed he entirely forgot court, advocate, and all surroundings.
So in the very first days of the county's legal system, the biggest concern wasn't justice, but a bird.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And when the lawyer finally finishes this long speech, the judge just sort of snaps out of it, realizes he wasn't paying attention at all.
Did he apologize?
Nope. He just made the lawyer repeat the entire argument from the beginning.
And then what?
And then came the first and maybe most famous judicial ruling in the town's history. Judge Willis turns to the sheriff and just barks, "Mr. Sheriff, take a gun and kill that D.D. woodpecker.
Yeah.
It interrupts this court."
That says everything, doesn't it? The fragility of formal authority.
Mm-hmm.
The final ruling had nothing to do with the case, but with getting rid of a nuisance.
It's that clash, you know? The civilized idea versus the wild reality. Which is a perfect transition, really, into our next section as we move from funny distractions to actual life and death.
Right. Let's get into segment 2. Lawmen, outlaws, and misdemeanor murders.
And for this, our main figure from the 20th century is John C. Riley.
He starts out as a deputy under Sheriff Hogan Oliver back in 1913. But he was clearly a sharp political operator from the start.
He really was. He knew how to play the game. His boss, Oliver, decided to run for state auditor.
Which created a power vacuum.
A big one. And Riley stepped right into it. He ran for sheriff himself in 1925. And because he was already associated with the office, he basically ran unopposed. He just walked right into the job.
And he became a hugely powerful figure in the region.
Immensely powerful. Not just sheriff of Ashley County, but also a United States Marshal under FDR. So he had local power and federal authority.
But for all that official power, his life didn't end in some heroic federal bust.
No. It ended in a way that feels like it's straight out of the 1800s. He was killed in a duel in Monticello in 1936.
A duel? With who?
A city officer named Ira Johnson. And the sources are pretty clear that the root of it wasn't political. It was something personal.
So you have a U.S. Marshal, a symbol of federal law and order, dying in what's essentially a shootout over a personal grudge.
It's that tension again. Official law versus raw human emotion. And that tragedy just ripples through his family.
His son, John Clark Riley.
Right. He becomes a B-24 pilot in World War II.
Right.
He joins the famous Traveling Circuses Bond Group. He represents that other path, you know? Official, patriotic sacrifice for the country.
But he dies tragically young.
On his 11th mission in August of 43, he was only 24. His plane crashed right after takeoff for that famous raid on the Ploesti oil fields in Romania.
And his commendation.
Mm.
It's incredibly powerful.
It is. It tries to make sense of that sacrifice. It says he stands in the unbroken line of patriots who have dared to die that freedom might live. It's this very official, heroic narrative that stands in such stark contrast to the kind of rough personal justice that took his father's life.
And that contrast between the harshness of the law and this unexpected shred of human dignity brings us to the story of Sam Blakely.
Likely. He has this grim distinction of being the only man legally hanged in the county's history.
But the real story here isn't the hanging itself, it's the actions of the sheriff, Floyd Walker.
Exactly. The empathy shown by Sheriff Walker is what's so compelling. The county allotted $5 for Blakely's burial. $5.
For everything.
For everything. But Sheriff Walker felt that the man, even though condemned, deserved a decent burial.
So he paid for it himself.
He did. He bought a wooden coffin for $20. He bought a starched shirt, a white collar, white socks. Blakely even asked for a pair of slippers to be buried in, and Walker got them for him.
That's a profound act of grace.
It is, recognizing his humanity right up to the end. Walker also arranged for him to be baptized right there in a bathtub at the county jail.
But the most revealing part is Blakely's own final statement.
Right before the end, the sheriff asked him if he wanted to make a little talk.
And he did. He asked if Mr. Kane, the father of the man he'd killed, was in the crowd.
He did. And then he directly challenged Kane's testimony from the trial. Kane had claimed that his son's pistol had 5 unused bullets in it.
Implying he never fired a shot.
Exactly. But Blakely, with his last breaths, looks toward Kane and says he wants to die with the truth in my mouth and in my heart. And then he says, someone must have put one in it because he shot at me one time.
Wow. So he wasn't denying the killing, but he was insisting it was self-defense right to the very end.
Challenging the official record in his last moment on Earth, it just speaks volumes about the deep distrust of the formal legal process.
Which brings us to this really grim social idea from the time. Misdemeanor murders.
A terrifying concept. It was this sort of unwritten social code in Fountain Hill and the areas around it.
So what was it exactly?
Basically, killers would sometimes get incredibly light sentences or even be acquitted because the public and by extension the jury felt that the victim needed killing.
So community opinion could just override the law.
It essentially became a form of vigilante justice sanctioned by a jury. The Vincent Hollis case is a perfect example.
Hollis killed a man named Pye Thurman.
Right. And the defense argued it was self-defense, that Thurman had been making threats against Hollis because of Hollis's relationship with Thurman's wife.
Okay, but threats aren't a legal justification for murder.
And the judge said exactly that. He instructed the jury very clearly. Threats are not a justification. But the jury didn't care.
They found him not guilty.
Not guilty, because the community sentiment was that Thurman had brought it on himself. The local logic won out over the letter of the law.
But even for Hollis, the man who got away with it, it wasn't really over.
Not at all. He couldn't just go back to his life. The source says he eventually moved out of state because he was tired of plowing with a Winchester strapped to the plow stalk and constantly having to glance over his shoulder.
So he was legally acquitted,
Yeah.
but socially condemned to live in fear.
Exactly. And you have to contrast this selective, almost personalized form of justice with the other side of the coin. Raw, brutal mob rule.
The lynchings.
Yeah. During Sheriff Riley's time, this was a tragic reality. In 1927, there was the case of Wilmot Pounds, a black farmhand.
What happened?
A mob of what the source calls a half-dozen determined men just took him from the jail. And the description is chilling. They carried out the lynching with quiet, business-like formality.
Business-like.
As if it were a transaction. No frenzy, just cold execution. Sheriff Riley only got there in time to find the body.
And that wasn't the only one.
No. 5 years later, another prisoner was lynched inside the city jail itself, hanged from a water pipe and just left there overnight. It's a stark reminder of the conflicting and racially charged realities of justice in that town.
It's just jarring. The formal system, the informal misdemeanor system, and then pure mob rule, all operating at the same time.
It is. Okay, let's shift the lens a bit. Let's look at how Fountain Hill's influence spread out into the wider world. This is segment 3, from the Hill to the world stage.
And you can't talk about that without talking about John Sparks, the man who became governor of Nevada.
The ultimate Fountain Hill success story. He only lived on the Hill until he was 14 back in the 1850s.
And the reason his family left is such a human story. It wasn't about some grand economic ambition at first.
No, it was about family. We know from a letter written by his older brother, Martin, that their mother, Sarah, was desperately homesick for her daughter who had already moved to Texas.
She just missed her daughter.
Deeply. So much so that she was ready to pack up the whole family and move anyway. And that one maternal feeling set in motion this incredible story of American enterprise.
So John Sparks heads west, and he becomes this cattle king.
And that's not an exaggeration. At his peak, he was running 70,000 head of cattle. 70,000.
That's an industrial scale.
It is. And he ended up owning 1/3 of all the privately owned land in the entire state of Nevada.
And from there, he becomes governor. But even a king isn't immune to disaster.
No. The cruel winter of 1889-90 was devastating for him. He lost 35,000 head of stock. Half his herd just wiped out.
A loss that would have destroyed anyone else.
But he survived it, which tells you just how vast his wealth really was.
Yet for all that power, all that wealth, his final moments were so simple.
They were. On his deathbed, someone passed him a child, and he just held the child and petted it with a smile.
And his last words.
"I'm not afraid to die. I've done my best all my life. I'm tired and I'm ready to go." It's just this incredibly humble end for a man who lived such a colossal life.
From the cattle king to a different kind of local royalty, Holt C. Hobbs, the Candyman.
A different scale, but just as important to the community. He lived in Fountain Hill for 61 years and was known for being a bit of everything. A good retailer, a butcher, even an ad designer and painter.
But he really became a lifeline during the Great Depression.
An absolute lifeline. He was a peddler, and a friend called his operation a Walmart in his car.
A Walmart in his car. I love that. So what did he do?
He essentially ran on a barter system. He'd get these big boxes of penny candy shipped in from Memphis.
Which would have been a huge luxury then.
A massive luxury. And he'd use that candy as currency. He might trade some for, say, 3 yards of good dress material from a local family. People couldn't get to the bigger towns, so they relied on him for everything.
And he had this philosophy of generosity and independence.
Absolutely. He was famous for inviting everyone he met into his home to eat, and he made a conscious choice to be his own general and boss, believing that's where his strength came from.
But that independence got put on hold by World War II.
It did. He was drafted into the Navy at age 36, which was old for a draftee.
So he got the nickname the Old Man.
The old man. The Candyman story is just this beautiful picture of small-town resilience and community spirit.
Okay, so we've seen the heights of power and the core of the community. Now we have to turn to some of the most difficult and complex parts of this story.
We do. This is segment 4, The Voices of the Displaced. And this really gets into the deep social and racial contradictions in the town's history.
We have to start with the story of Judge Hill. He was born a slave in Georgia.
And he was later sold to Isaac Denson, the founder of Fountain Hill, the man we started with.
And Judge Hill lived to be 92. He saw almost a century of change.
And crucially, he wrote about his life for the Farm News. So we have his own perspective on that history, on that family. It's an invaluable voice.
And his story connects right back to that litigious nature of the early families, the constant lawsuits.
Yes, especially around a man named William Daniel, who owned many slaves and was always in court over them.
He was sued because people claimed one of the women he held as a slave was actually white.
That's right. He was sued for her freedom. And a jury found that she and her children were, in fact, white, and they ruled against Daniel. It just shows how obsessed they were with property, but also how arbitrary the lines of race and freedom could be in the legal system.
And that theme of categorization and displacement carries right into the 20th century with the Japanese-American internment camp near Fountain Hill.
The Denson Camp.
The Denson Camp. The irony of that name is just staggering.
It's a huge cognitive dissonance. The source points it out directly. The camp was named for a Denson who fought in a war that freed the American Negro.
But then the source also notes.
It notes that in everyday life in that region, black citizens were often treated worse than the German and Italian prisoners of war held at a nearby POW camp. The name stood for freedom, but the reality on the ground was something else entirely.
And the camp itself. The numbers are just sobering.
Over 6,700 Japanese Americans were held there, most from the West Coast. And the most important fact, 60 to 70% of them were American citizens.
Living in barracks covered in black tar paper.
Right. And we have a personal account from George Sakaguchi. He was interned there when he was 16 years old.
And he was a citizen, which made a difference for him.
It made a small but crucial difference. Because he was a citizen, he was allowed to leave the camp in early 1943 to go work in Chicago. It was an opportunity the non-citizens, including many of their parents, were denied.
And he dedicated his later life to preserving the memory of that time.
He did. He worked to preserve the monuments at the nearby Roser camp to make sure that physical evidence that strange, troubling time wasn't forgotten.
And those monuments, they honor the men from the camps who fought and died for the U.S. in the war.
Yes, specifically 30 men from the camp community who died serving in the 442nd Infantry Combat Team Battalion,
The Purple Heart Battalion.
the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. military history. They received a high citation from President Truman for their super fine service.
And they were doing this, fighting and dying for America, while their families were locked up behind barbed wire in places like the Denson camp.
It's one of the most powerful and painful contradictions in all of American history, fighting for a country that had imprisoned your family.
And the scrapbook gives us another little window into life inside the camp from a teacher who worked there.
Right, she wrote under a pen name. And she noticed the cultural differences right away. Her students, mostly from California, were used to what she called freewheeling teaching methods.
But they adapted quickly to the more structured Arkansas routine.
They did. But what's really fascinating are her notes on their language.
They would say United States.
United State, singular. And you have to wonder if that wasn't just a grammatical slip. For these kids, their entire world, their entire nation, had been reduced to that one single state of confinement.
And she recorded one student's description of Robin Hood.
Which is just perfect. He was good sports, had considerations for women, stoic from the riches, and gave to the poors.
It's a beautiful, uniquely American summary of an English folk hero coming from a Japanese-American teenager imprisoned in Arkansas during a world war.
It shows that Fountain Hill's story isn't just local. It's global history playing out in one small town. Okay, let's shift to our last section here.
Segment 5. The Keepers of the Flame. The people who actively worked to preserve the community's culture and memory.
And we have to start with the Gardner sisters. Their family literally provided the land for the local school back in 1901.
And one of the sisters, Maud Gardner Harris, taught at that school for nearly 30 years.
And she was a painter. She painted scenes of the Ashley County area, including a painting of the old school building itself. So she was preserving the landscape, the institutions, through art.
And her sister, Minnie Bell, she wrote a book, All Wool and a Yard Wide.
Exactly. They were teachers, yes, but they were also active cultural archivists, preserving the story in art and in print.
And for our final story, we go back to where we started, that fierce, litigious nature of the founding families, embodied by one person.
Elizabeth Thompson, the litigious grandmother. Her story from 1852 is just incredible.
She sued her own family.
Her own husband and her own daughter-in-law.
And what was she suing them for?
The ownership of two enslaved people, Luke and Dave. She claimed they were legally hers, based on a deed of gift from her father from way back in 1810.
So this was about her trying to assert separate property rights as a woman, which was almost unheard of then.
That's the core of it. She was arguing that this human property was given to her for her assistance and comfort because she was aged and infirm, and that her husband had refused to legally record the deed, leaving her vulnerable.
And her daughter-in-law fought back.
Fiercely, she claimed her dead husband had legally bought the slaves for $1,600 and that they were part of his estate, not Elizabeth's personal property.
It's a family tearing itself apart over human property.
Spanning 3 generations, Elizabeth actually won the first round in court, but her daughter-in-law, who had since remarried into the Denson family, of course, she immediately appealed. Her story is just this powerful testament to the fierce, relentless, and often brutal nature of these early families.
It's just, what a journey this has been. This deep dive has covered so much ground. The founders, the hustlers, the distracted judge, the high sheriff's violent end, the humanity shown to a condemned man, the soldiers fighting for a country that imprisoned their families.
And that's the magic of Frank Dunson's work, isn't it? He didn't clean it up. He didn't separate the good from the bad. He just put it all together. The people of Fountain Hill, they're like pieces of a hand-sewn rug.
That's a great analogy. They really are mismatched scraps. You've got the expensive silk from Governor John Sparks.
You've got the tough working denim from the hustler, Isaac Denson.
The simple cotton from the executed prisoner, Sam Blakely.
And the black tar paper from the internment barracks. They're all jagged and uneven. They don't fit together perfectly.
But Frank Denson, racing against his own body, with his friend climbing a wall to help him, he braided all those pieces together so tightly.
So tightly that they form this single, unbreakable fabric of human experience. A history that refuses to fade away because he wouldn't let it.
So as you've listened to all this, think about the human cost of just keeping this record alive. You have Denson and Deckelman literally risking their health and safety to compile these stories.
And you have the unbelievable contradiction of the Japanese-American soldiers fighting in the Purple Heart Battalion for freedom while their own families were in a camp named after a man who fought for freedom. It's a history full of courage and full of these deep, uncomfortable contradictions.
So the question that Denson's scrapbook leaves us with is this. How do we, now that we have this living ledger, ensure that the full, challenging polygenetic truth is the legacy we choose to preserve and carry forward, instead of just the easy?
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of your source material articles, research notes, historical documents, and carve out the most important nuggets of knowledge and surprising insights.
And today's dive is, it's a special one.
It really is. Our mission today is to explore something extraordinary that one of you shared with us. It's a compilation of local history focused on a small area of Arkansas known as Fountain Hill.
But this is not your standard academic textbook. Not at all.
No. It is, it's a profound piece of personal history, and it's driven by this urgency that just leaps right off the page.
It is truly unique. This collection, compiled by a man named Frank E. Denson, is raw, it's intimate, and it's surprisingly philosophical about what a historical record even is.
And Denson himself gives us the perfect description for it.
He does. He calls his own finished work a scrapbook of polygenetic bits and pieces.
Okay, let's unpack that specific language immediately because it dictates the entire methodology of this work. Polygenetic.
Right. It's such a deliberate word. He's signaling that the sources are not unified. They come from everywhere, from multiple diverse origins.
So we're talking about everything from, dry legal ledgers and property deeds to personal letters and even local rumors.
Exactly. This is a history built from fragments. And the beauty of it, the thing that makes it so compelling, is that Denson completely embraces the imperfection of that whole process.
That acceptance of imperfection is really the central thesis of the entire compilation, isn't it?
It is. Denson explicitly states that his whole approach stems from this deep personal commitment to preservation over polish. He admits he wasn't trained in that field, formal history.
And he actually invites criticism.
Yeah. He asks you, the reader, to overlook any inaccurate information presented as fact, and to please contact him if you find errors.
Which is just not something a traditional historian would ever do.
Never. For Denson, he was operating against that conventional wisdom, haste makes waste.
Yeah.
His priority was crystal clear. Having a flawed record was infinitely better than having no record at all.
And that urgency, that conscious choice to pick haste over measured perfection, it becomes completely understandable when you look at the circumstances under which he was working.
Oh, absolutely.
This wasn't some leisurely academic sabbatical. This was a desperate race against time.
Precisely. The motivation behind the project is profoundly human and physical. Denson reveals he was sort of unexpectedly thrust into the role of local historian.
He calls it a misunderstanding at an alumni banquet.
Right, which is just a great little detail.
Yeah.
But more critically, he was compiling this massive work while living with a progressive, debilitating disease.
And he details his condition right there in the historical binder. He draws a direct line between his physical state and the rapid pace of the work.
He does. He reveals that he is living with multiple sclerosis, and because he wants to be perfectly clear to his future readers, he actually includes his dictionary's definition.
What does it say?
It says, a chronic, degenerative, and generally progressive disease in which hardening of tissue occurs. This isn't just background noise. This is the engine of the entire project.
Wow.
Yeah. Imagine trying to handle fragile, brittle historical documents, write out complex notes, conduct interviews, all while experiencing the effects of MS.
And on top of that, he was facing an impending eye operation.
Right, which added another layer of time pressure to document what he could still see and process.
The implication is just so clear. This work isn't just history, it's an act of sheer will. It's a physical manifestation of a legacy being preserved by a man whose body was failing him. And that effort, it just lends immense weight to every single scrap he retrieved. It makes the entire project feel like a last testament to a fading community memory.
It absolutely does. The raw quality, the inclusion of rumors, the gaps in the story, it all suddenly becomes less about sloppy scholarship and more about immediate, essential truth.
And this framework is so vital as we move through the sources.
It's everything.
So today we are structuring our deep dive around this unique polygenetic compilation. We're going to explore the literal and abstract roots of this place called Fountain Hill.
The surprising success of its education system, despite some very humble beginnings.
The secret economic codes hidden in its bank ledgers.
And the chilling reality of its dark history of violence.
And finally, how global events echoed in this seemingly isolated Arkansas town.
We're going to trace the jagged lines of this mosaic Denson assembled, linking the urgency of his personal mission to the resilience and the occasional absurdity of the community he documented.
It's an approach to history that focuses less on a polished chronology and more on unforgettable detail.
Exactly.
So let's begin at the very foundation, the physical geography that gave Fountain Hill its life and its name. This community wasn't settled arbitrarily, was it? It was strategically founded on a very specific ridge.
Right, and that location selection reveals some early pioneering shrewdness. Fountain Hill is situated perfectly on a ridge, and it's positioned between two crucial waterways, Flat Creek on the north and Fountain Creek on the south.
And that geographical feature created immediate environmental diversity.
Which was the key to economic survival back in the 1840s. You couldn't just have one type of land.
That diversity sounds incredible, especially when you compare it to the monolithic farming operations we see today. The sources highlight just how distinct each topographical area was.
Well, take the creek bottoms. They're described as rich and alluvial, teeming with these things called cane brakes.
And those cane brakes weren't just decorative plants, they were essential for early livestock, right?
Absolutely essential. They provided fine winter pasture, which meant the pioneers could keep their animals healthy even during the leanest months without having to use up all their stored feed. It's a remarkable example of just maximizing your natural resources.
So that's the bottomland. Meanwhile, the ridge itself, the hill, was high, dry, and composed of sandy silt.
Which was ideal for farming cash crops. Because the soil was relatively loose and well-draining, it was perfectly suitable for profitable cultivation.
So you have this immediate synergy. The bottomlands support the animals.
And the ridge supports the cash crops. It created a self-sustaining early economy right from the start.
The land use gets even more granular around the town center. The sources talk about the flatwoods to the southeast.
And those were crucial for timber. They provided fine timber and mast for hogs, growing on a fine, tight, silt soil. But then, to the east of that, you have the Fountain Prairie.
Which was a different kind of challenge.
A totally different set of challenges and benefits. It was described as highland, and it served as the source of all the local streams. But the source notes that this soil was really difficult because it ran together after each rain, making systematic cultivation incredibly hard.
So pioneers couldn't easily plow and plant corn there, but what did they do with it? They didn't just let it go to waste?
No, they adapted.
Yeah.
The prairie grew this wild hay that some farmers cut by hand, stacked and fed to their stock in wintertime.
By hand.
By hand. This detail just throws into sharp relief the sheer manual labor required. You couldn't rely on a tractor. You had dozens of farmers out there with scythes, manually cutting, curing, and stacking this wild hay just to ensure their animals survived the cold.
It really speaks volumes about their commitment to using every square inch of that polygenetic landscape.
It does. And this dependence on topography is perfectly illustrated by the setups of one of the key early figures, a man named James N. Norris.
His farm stretched north and south across the main road near his spring.
And Norris's setup is basically a map of early commerce. His residence and his store were positioned right on top of the hill, dry, visible, and convenient for anyone passing by.
But his industrial infrastructure, the gin and the grist mill,
Those were located near the spring below. You can't run a mill without water power or reliable water access, so the hill provided the vantage point and the creek provided the power. It was an exercise in pure logistical placement.
this landscape, it naturally gave rise to the community's identity, and that brings us to the naming mythos.
Right. The town was named Fountain Hill by Isaac Denson, who arrived in 1842.
And Isaac Denson wasn't just any farmer. The source calls him a prosperous and energetic farmer.
So successful that he earned the nickname, the Hustler. He was clearly an engine of early local commerce.
And he named the town after Fountain Hill, North Carolina, which was his birthplace.
And that move, naming a new wild settlement after an old established home, it's this abstract act of creating instant artificial tradition right there on the frontier.
Isaac Denson, born 1794, and his brother Thomas, born 1802, they were among the earliest arrivals in 1842. By 1850, the family line was well established. Isaac's successors were Shadrach and Montgomery.
And what's interesting is the sheer stability of the settlement. The sources confirm that many other early settlers from the 1840s, families like Thomas Watkins and Thomas J. Thurman, they established families whose descendants still remain in the area today.
That longevity really suggests that their initial economic calculations, the rich land, the diverse resources,
Yeah.
they were correct. They weren't just passing through.
No, they put down deep roots.
But the stability and the formality of this budding settlement were sometimes derailed by the chaos of frontier life. And that leads us to one of the most memorable scraps Denson collected, the woodpecker incident.
Oh, this anecdote is perfect. It perfectly captures the improvised nature of early American governance.
So Ashley County is formed in 1848.
Right. And the state legislature, lacking a dedicated building, designates Isaac Denson's house as the temporary county courthouse.
The Hustler's house.
The Hustler's house.
Yeah.
And Denson was paid a small stipend, $5 per session, for renting out his front porch for the administration of justice.
$5 for the use of your front porch and the entire community gathering there. You have to imagine the scene. A legal proceeding of immense importance is being held literally outside.
And the Denson house had this broad porch extending its entire length in front, around which was a railing.
So now we zoom in on this specific moment. An attorney is delivering what the source calls an elaborate argument before a Judge Willis.
This is supposed to be high legal drama, but nature intrudes.
The judge became completely fixated on a red-headed woodpecker.
Flying repeatedly between two specific points. A mulberry tree, which was bearing ripe fruit, and an old pine snag right near the broad front porch railing.
He was so absorbed that, according to the sources, he entirely forgot court, advocate, and all surrounding.
Just gone, lost in the moment.
So once the attorney finished his elaborate plea, the judge sort of snaps back to reality, realizes he hasn't heard a single word of it.
And just asks the lawyer to start the argument all over again.
Which is bad enough, forcing a lawyer to repeat his entire carefully constructed argument. But then comes the definitive judicial action, the decree that has survived 150 years in the town's memory.
Judge Willis, irritated by the interruption, turns to the sheriff.
And he orders, "Mr. Sheriff, take a gun and kill that DAD woodpecker. It interrupts this court."
It's the ultimate expression of frontier justice and improvisation. The highest legal authority in the county halts all proceedings to order the execution of a bird for contempt of court.
It's unbelievable.
What Denson captures here isn't just a funny story. It's a profound commentary on the chaos underlying the attempt at order. The physical location, a porch next to a fruit tree, was always going to allow the natural world to intrude on human constructs like law.
And that's exactly why Denson included it in his polygenetic heap of scraps. It's the raw, undeniable truth of what happened, something a historian focused only on dry legal outcomes would just edit out.
Denson preferred the moment of truth over the polished narrative, every time.
The woodpecker incident showed the chaos of temporary governance, and that chaos just reinforces the absolute necessity of establishing formal institutions.
And in the case of Fountain Hill, that meant education.
Absolutely. Moving from the literal roots of the place to the foundation of its society, the source material really focuses on the reality of early education. And it uses the Gardner School as a prime example.
This school was founded in 1901 when two grandparents, Will and Ellen Gardner, deeded 2 acres of land for a symbolic $10.
It operated for nearly 3 decades until 1929. And these one-room schools, like Gardner, they were so much more than simple classrooms.
They were the undisputed social centers of their surrounding communities. I mean, think of the events, the debates, the holiday parties, all contained within those 4 walls. They taught hundreds of children the fundamentals necessary for survival and prosperity in an agrarian economy.
What were those crucial fundamentals? Denson lists them very clearly. Skills in reading, penmanship, and ciphering.
The 3 R's, essentially. Reading to understand legal documents in the Bible, penmanship to conduct business and correspondence, and ciphering basic arithmetic to manage inventory, tally accounts, and understand crop yields.
And Denson, our compiler, he remembers the intense social benefit of that environment. He notes that sharing the learning experience in those tight quarters provided a camaraderie that I have not known before or since.
Which speaks to the powerful unifying force of shared struggle in the pursuit of knowledge.
But here's the poignant contrast. We look at the legacy of these vital institutions, and time has essentially erased them. Today, the sources note, the site of the Gardner School is just silence.
The place is now defined by a lonely dirt road, which was once a main highway, but is now merely a trail on a woodsman's map.
Marked only by one aged oak tree.
It is a profound metaphor for the loss that Denson was fighting against. The memory is fading, the physical structure is gone, and only one living sentinel, that aged oak, remains to mark where hundreds of lives were shaped.
That image is what fuels Denson's own project, that deep-seated fear that everything will just disappear, leaving only a faint trail.
And that brings us directly to the act of retrieval, the incredible lengths Denson went to secure these fading memories. This reinforces his whole philosophy, right? A flawed record is better than none.
He documented the extraordinary difficulty he faced just trying to get basic information. Letters went unacknowledged.
And the physical source material he found, like the yearbooks, they were cut, torn, scribbled on, and were in very poor condition.
He wasn't dealing with pristine archives in a university library. He was dealing with the literal scraps of memory, fragile and damaged.
But the most incredible story in this segment involves securing the list of graduates from the past 9 years. And this is where Denson's personal struggle intersected with the historical quest, and he needed some serious help.
His assistant, a man named Leroy Deckelman, offered that help after recognizing Denson's progressively worsening condition due to his MS.
And the method they chose for information retrieval. It sounds less like archival research and more like a heist.
It really does. Since official staff weren't cooperating or couldn't access the records, Deckelman scaled the walls at the school building to get the names.
While Denson, the historian suffering from a degenerative disease, held the ladder.
Wait, just let that sink in. The historian, whose body was failing him, was holding the ladder, staking his life on the physical strength of his assistant, while that assistant was physically breaking boundaries just to retrieve the names of past students.
It's not just dedication. It is a visceral commitment to legacy that just transcends any standard historical practice.
It absolutely crystallizes that sense of urgency we talked about in the intro. Denson was prioritizing the retrieval of that information, those names, those memories, above comfort, above safety, and even above legal procedure.
This one little scrap is a testament to trust and desperation, ensuring the names of those students would not be lost simply because they couldn't get into the building.
And the scrappy history, it's woven into the architecture itself. The history of the Fountain Hill School plant illustrates this constant cycle of improvisation and adaptation.
Like when a one-room school burned down in 1917, V.S. Bright, who was one of Arkansas's first vocational agriculture teachers, he arrives in 1919 and successfully campaigns to consolidate the district.
And that consolidation led to the construction of a more substantial modern facility, the 1930 brick building, overseen by the State Department of Education.
Yet even this symbol of progress carries a mysterious flaw that Denson documents with this fascinating discretion.
The source notes that the building was 10 feet short of plans on the south end.
And the original writer of that historical note 52 years ago chose not to elaborate. He just states that some history is best not written and leaves the explanation for future generations.
It's an intentional void in the record, a physical imperfection that matches Denson's methodological imperfection. It suggests some major compromise, maybe political maneuvering or a budget dispute that someone decided was too controversial or embarrassing to record permanently.
Right. The writer provided the fact of the shortage, but deliberately withheld the context. This act of self-censorship becomes its own historical scrap for us to analyze.
Yet despite these humble origins, despite the compromises and the physical flaws, the school's core mission succeeded spectacularly. We actually have the data to contrast the humble physical reality with the surprising abstraction of academic achievement decades later.
And the results are astounding. Denson was able to secure the 1998 Stanford Achievement Test results, published in January 1999. Fountain Hill, this small, rural, consolidating school district, ranked 4th among these 39 schools tested in South Arkansas.
4th. Let's look at those specific scores because they tell a pretty nuanced story about where their strengths lay. The statewide average for 5th grade was 47.
But Fountain Hill scored a remarkable 56.
For 7th grade, the state average was 49.
Fountain Hill scored 53.
The 10th grade average was 48, and Fountain Hill scored 46, so a little bit of a lag there.
But the immediate takeaway is that the foundational education, those core skills of reading, penmanship, and ciphering that Denson celebrated from the one-room schools, they were clearly being taught with incredible effectiveness.
To score 9 points above the state average in 5th grade suggests a commitment to literacy and fundamental math that is truly exceptional.
But that slight drop-off at the 10th grade level is also really informative. It makes you wonder, right? Were the fundamentals solid, but maybe the resources, the specialized teachers, or the advanced curriculum needed for high school excellence were just lacking?
It suggests a system that invested deeply in the basics, ensuring every child had a strong foundation, even if the later resources couldn't compete with larger, more affluent districts.
It demonstrates resilience and focus. They maximize their returns on the essential skills. The quality of the people, the teachers, the dedicated community far outweighed the compromises in the building or the age of the facility.
It's a powerful illustration that success isn't solely determined by infrastructure budgets.
Not at all.
So moving now to the economic lifeblood of the town. This is where Denson, the historian, truly became Denson the detective. He uncovered this marvelous secret language hidden in the town's bank records.
This takes us inside the Fountain Hill Bank, which was established in 1913. When Denson examined the old hand-posted ledgers, he found these entries that initially appeared to be secret codes indicating financial peril.
And his initial assumption was completely logical within the context of agrarian finance. He saw these massive seasonal fluctuations in the bank's notes receivable, the money the bank was owed.
Right. In January 1928, it was low, about $17,700. But by August 1928, during the peak growing season, it had more than doubled to over $39,400.
That surge reflects farmers taking out loans to buy seed, equipment, and pay labor before the harvest comes in. And if the harvest fails, that debt becomes bad credit.
So Denson logically assumed that these mysterious codes, like BP and BC, they must refer to things like bad pay or bad credit, tracking who was risky.
But the revelation, the core finding of his detective work, was that these codes had nothing to do with personal credit ratings.
Because most customers were diligent and paid off their loans when the crops came in. The codes were simply a language of trade, a bookkeeping, shorthand tracking collateral, and payments made with commodities.
So what did they stand for?
BP stood for bushels of potatoes, and BC stood for bales of cotton.
That's fantastic. It was an internal, secret language of agrarian finance, designed to quickly record a deposit made in bushels or bales rather than currency.
It instantly grounds us in the specific economic reality of the time. The wealth of the community was literally measured in cotton and potatoes, and the bank's ledgers reflect that agricultural priority.
And that wasn't the only coded language he found.
No. To manage their local clientele efficiently, they also use shorthand operational codes to identify customers by their occupation or status.
Like what?
C meant colored, RH meant road hand, BM was Baptist minister, MP was Methodist preacher, and T was teacher. This allowed the bookkeepers to instantly understand the client's social context and likely income stream, which would streamline their transaction process.
And speaking of streamlined operations, there's a truly fascinating financial scrap that speaks volumes about the local nature of the bank's business.
Oh, the postage.
The postage. The total yearly postage expense for the entire bank in 1928 was a mere $82.19.
Which is incredibly low for a modern bank today, even when you account for inflation. Denson drew a clear conclusion from this tiny figure.
Checking account statements were not mailed out.
Right. Which means that customers were either picking up their statements or, more likely, conducting almost all their transactions in person. It fostered that intense local relationship between client and banker.
It suggests a banking relationship built on trust and face-to-face interaction, which is so unlike the digital finance we know today.
Completely different world.
The economic connection to the outside world, however, ran on rails. Fountain Hill was served by multiple railroads, including the AL&G and the famously nicknamed All Day and Night, or AD&N.
And these railroads were the arteries that connected the town's agrarian production to wider markets. Their cargo was the wealth of the region. Vast amounts of timber products, lumber, pulpwood, cross ties, alongside the farm produce we just discussed, cotton, potatoes, onions, tomatoes.
But Denson highlights that not all cargo translated to cash.
No. The section on the most worthless shipments is a painful portrait of agricultural vulnerability. In the late 1920s, that dubious distinction went to cars of cabbage.
Cabbage.
Farmers had invested heavily, dedicating land and labor, expecting a significant payout. The harvest itself was likely bountiful, but something catastrophic happened to the market or the logistics.
The crop was so unprofitable, the price per pound so low, that the value of the cabbage itself did not even cover the cost of getting it to market.
Which means the shipping company still had to be paid. The source states that the farmers were subsequently billed for freight due because the cabbage had not paid the freight to ship it.
So wait, you work all season, you grow a successful crop, you ship it out believing you've created wealth, only to receive an invoice for the deficit.
It's an unbelievable demonstration of the risks inherent in commodity markets. Success isn't just about growing the product, but about timing the market, or risking total financial penalty for your labor. It's an economic bust captured in one chilling detail.
And the economic history also catalogs the unexpected, if mundane, costs of progress, the environmental and personal tolls extracted by the railroad.
Yet we find records detailing the compensation paid out for livestock killed by the trains. These iron horses speeding through the rural landscape were deadly.
And the source gives a specific example.
It does. A man named Charles W. Phillips was paid $207 for the loss of 2 mules, a colt, 2 heifers, and 2 sows. Infrastructure brought prosperity, but it came with a literal price paid to maintain farm livelihoods destroyed by the tracks.
And now, finally, Denson shifts from commodity cargo timber, cotton, cabbage to the human element. He details what he called the most priceless cargo.
This was a non-paying passenger who rode the rails.
An individual who was suffering from an addiction to a legitimate drug and would travel to Monticello, which was presumably a larger town with better supply.
To hit every drugstore before making the return trip.
And this detail is stunning because Denson, who has spent paragraphs detailing cash flow and profit margins, isolates this man as the priority. He notes that this individual was the cargo the townspeople were most concerned about.
It's such a powerful contrast. It contrasts the relentless, profit-driven nature of the economy with the deep sense of localized, compassionate community. In a place where you risked losing your farm over a bad cabbage shipment, the true weight of concern was reserved not for commodities, but for a suffering neighbor fighting a private war against addiction.
Denson chose to include this human vulnerability right alongside the ledgers and the shipping manifests.
It just reinforces that his history is polygenetic, a blend of finance and fellowship.
The inclusion of these deeply personal and vulnerable human details, like the priceless cargo, it provides a necessary bridge to the darker, more violent aspects of Fountain Hill's past. As Denson compiled these scraps, he did not shy away from the town's shadows.
No, and he transitions to this subject with a stark warning about the difference between past and present legal accountability. He observes that if certain crimes he documented happened today, the county would be saturated with federal agents.
Which sets the stage for a period where accountability was highly localized, sporadic, and often brutal. He immediately points to the violence during the Reconstruction era, specifically from 1867 to 1869.
And the context here is critical. Political instability. Elected local officials were forcibly removed by military proclamation, and martial law was declared.
The incoming military forces had instructions to forage off the county,
which essentially means confiscating goods to sustain themselves. This instability led to a complete breakdown of civil life. For 15 months, the county was in turmoil. Property was confiscated, goods and merchandise were taken from the citizens, and people were killed.
And the sources emphasize this contrast in leadership. The officials who were removed by the military were often respected men who had served as officers during the Civil War, while the appointed replacements were bitterly termed turncoats and scalawags.
So this context of imposed, resented authority, it just fueled the underlying violence and set a precedent for a kind of informal justice.
Amidst all this instability, the source documents the one moment of absolute, if grim, legal formality. The execution of Sam Blakely on June 18, 1912, the county's only legal hanging.
But what Denson preserves here are the human details surrounding the event.
The local sheriff, Floyd Walker, took on an immensely personal role. The county judge only allowed a meager $5 for the entire disposal of the body.
But Sheriff Walker stepped in to ensure Blakely received a decent burial.
He spent his own money. $20 for a wood coffin, a suit of clothes, white socks, and a starched shirt.
And in a moment of extraordinary human dignity afforded to a condemned man, the sheriff purchased Blakely's livers because Blakely had asked for them.
Wow.
It's an act of kindness right before the finality of death that is just unforgettable. It's a scrap of humanity preserved against the chilling formality of the law.
And Blakely, standing on the gallows, he used his final speech not for a general confession, but for a specific challenge to the evidence that was used to condemn him. After asking if the victim's father, a Mr. Kane, was present, Blakely declared, "I know I am going to die, and I want to die with the truth in my mouth and in my heart."
And he then proceeded to just dismantle the prosecution's case in front of the assembled crowd. He questioned the evidence of the pistol used against him, noting that Kane had testified the gun had 5 cartridges when given to his son and 5 when returned.
Yet the victim had shot at Blakely once.
Right. So Blakely concluded, someone must have put one in it. He spent his final, precious moments asserting a specific, final detail of truth, demanding the official record be corrected even as his life was ending.
That detail of the slippers and that final technical challenge from the gallows floor, those are the moments of raw truth that Denson captured. But the most chilling abstract concept that Denson illuminates is what he terms a misdemeanor murder.
This is a devastating concept because it exposes the workings of an extra-legal system of societal judgment. Denson explains that a killing could be informally dubbed a misdemeanor murder if the general public thought the victim needed killing or had it coming.
So this meant that if the societal consensus believed the victim was morally culpable, the legal system might just grant impunity, or at least the community would excuse the perpetrator.
It's a parallel justice system where the law meant less than local opinion.
And the specific example given is a man named Vincent Hollis who killed a man known as Pi Thurman in a confrontation related to Thurman's wife. Hollis pleaded self-defense and was acquitted by a jury.
So legally, the matter was settled.
But socially, it was not. Hollis was so anxious about retribution or informal justice that he eventually left the state. He grew tired of plowing with a Winchester strapped to the plow stalk and constantly having to glance over his shoulder.
The legal acquittal did nothing to erase the pervasive threat of a local vendetta or social condemnation. The threat of violence, even when the law sided with him, forced him out.
And that societal permission for violence, that sense that some victims had it coming, tragically culminated in the horrifying events of mob rule, specifically lynchings during Sheriff John Riley's tenure.
Denson documents the lynching of Wilmot Pounds, a 20-year-old black farmhand, in 1927. Pounds was taken by a mob of a half-dozen determined men and found hanging.
And what is particularly chilling is the description of the mob's demeanor. The act was carried out with quiet, business-like formality.
That phrase, quiet business-like formality, it suggests a deeply entrenched cultural acceptance of mob justice, where a horrific act of terror was conducted with the chilling efficiency of a commercial transaction.
And 5 years later, under the same sheriff, a second unsolved lynching occurred when a prisoner was found hanging in the city jail.
The repetition of these brutal unsolved crimes, sanctioned by public indifference or fear, it shows that Fountain Hill, like many communities of that era, harbored a profound, unresolved darkness beneath its surface.
These scraps, from the execution of a woodpecker to the purchase of slippers for a condemned man to the casual, businesslike murder of a young man, they show that Denson's history is anything but tidy. It captures the full, messy spectrum of human behavior under duress.
And despite its physical isolation and its deep local focus on cotton and cane breaks and creek bottoms, Fountain Hill was never truly insulated from the outside world.
Not at all. Individuals born here went on to play roles on a grand, even global stage, or global events came directly to their doorstep.
Let's start with the boy who made the biggest mark, John Sparks. Born in Fountain Hill, went west and became the legendary cattle king and eventually governor of Nevada.
His life was defined by the sheer scale of his ambition.
And the scale is staggering. At one point, he owned 70,000 head of cattle. This level of accumulation required immense risk and capital. His success allowed him to transcend his humble beginnings, becoming a part owner of the Sparks Steel Bank and maintaining a 10,000-acre cotton plantation back in the South, even while running his empire out west.
He was a true self-made industrialist.
But even a cattle king could be humbled by nature. His fortune experienced a dramatic boom and bust cycle. He lost 35,000 head of stock, half his massive herd, in the cruel winter of 1889-90.
A loss that would have crushed a lesser man, but Sparks bounced back, cementing his reputation as a Western icon of resilience.
But the source documents reveal that the motivation for his family's original move west was deeply personal, not purely economic. While the prevailing myth was often, "Go west, young man," a letter written in 1856 by his 17-year-old brother, Martin Van Buren Sparks, suggests the true driver was family longing.
Martin writes that their mother was distraught, desperate to see her daughter, Elizabeth Sparks Denson, who had migrated to Texas years earlier by ox cart.
The emotional stakes are palpable. Martin records his mother's desperation, writing, "She wants to see you so bad that at times it appears she will make us get ready and go to Texas anyway."
So the Great American Migration wasn't always fueled by gold rush dreams. Sometimes it was powered by a mother's need to reunite her family. And that raw human motivation drove John Sparks from Fountain Hill into the wider world.
And as his life concluded, His final words really echoed the themes of urgency and completion that Denson was facing while compiling his book.
Just before his death, Sparks roused, looked at those around him, and gave his final assessment of his massive, risky life.
He said, "I'm not afraid to die. I've done my best all my life. I'm tired and I'm ready to go."
It's an epitaph that speaks to a profound exhaustion following a life lived at a punishing pace, much like the pace Denson set for himself to compile this history.
And shifting gears entirely, the largest global event of the 20th century, World War II, came directly to Fountain Hill in the form of the Denson Camp.
This was the Jerome Denson internment camp that held over 6,700 Japanese Americans, primarily evacuated from the West Coast. The camp's name itself connects back to the local history, named after a Fountain Hill man.
And Denson himself points out the profound, challenging irony of the situation. He notes that the man the camp was named after was associated with the political movement that freed the American Negro, who in his everyday life was in most cases treated worse than any Japanese, German, or Italian prisoner housed in this country.
That juxtaposition is searing. The camp, established under the guise of protection or security, carried the name of a man associated with emancipation, yet was housing American citizens under conditions Denson argued were better than the systemic injustices faced daily by local black citizens.
It's a complex ethical scrap that Denson refused to sanitize.
And life inside the camp, however, revealed the resilient spirit and patriotism of the internees. A teacher at the camp noted the contrast in educational methods. Many students were from California, where teaching methods were more freewheeling, but she preferred the Arkansas routine because it was more systematic.
The internees were highly skilled. The teacher noted they excelled at map making and woodwork, and they printed well and rapidly. But most importantly, their loyalty to the country that incarcerated them was unimpeachable.
They bought more war bonds than most other units, often giving up meager resources to support the war effort.
And their combat record proved their commitment. They proved themselves fighting in Italy and received a formal citation from President Harry Truman. The teacher remembered hearing the record of their superfine service to their country, and she expressed that she was greatly thrilled by their bravery while their families remained behind barbed wire.
That resilience brings us to the final scrap of this deep dive, a local legend of ingenuity during another massive national crisis, the Great Depression. The story of Holt C. Hobbs, known simply as the Candyman.
Hobbs lived in Fountain Hill for 61 years, and during the hardest economic times, he became an essential, innovative retailer. He turned his car into a literal mobile store, a Walmart, as Denson calls it, decades before the actual company existed.
He sold penny candy door to door, which is how he earned the nickname, but he also sold crucial household goods. And he understood the importance of premiums and incentives to drive sales in a struggling economy, offering rewards like 3 yards of dress material to his customers.
He was a true entrepreneur, an excellent retailer, and an innovative ad designer. His philosophy was based on fierce independence and creativity. He believed he could be successful as long as he maintained control over his own innovative ideas, never letting the market dictate his terms entirely.
And his hospitality was as famous as his business acumen. He invited everyone he met into his home to share a meal prepared by his wife.
It's a scrap of pure Depression-era ingenuity, where commerce was inextricably linked to community care. He recognized that providing for the physical and social needs of his neighbors was the true path to sustainable success.
So we've spent this deep dive exploring Frank E. Denson's concept of the polygenetic heap of scraps.
And from the judge ordering the execution of a bothersome woodpecker, to the secret bank codes tracking potatoes and cotton, to a sheriff buying slippers for a condemned man, to the profound loyalty of interned American citizens, these pieces do not form a single, smooth historical line.
No, they form a complex, jagged mosaic. What Denson's compilation reveals is that Fountain Hill was never a passive place. It was always vibrating with intense human effort. It was driven by the haste of people like Isaac Denson setting down roots, or people like John Sparks trying to make their monumental mark on the world before they were ready to go.
The history Denson preserved is defined by urgency and the commitment to leave a record, no matter how fragmented or flawed. And this mission was compounded by his own physical struggle. He preferred the raw, immediate truth of an improvised, quickly compiled document over letting memory just disappear beneath that one aged oak tree on a lonely dirt road.
And Denson's methodology, the historian, holding the ladder while his assistant scaled the walls, all while he's battling a degenerative disease, it forces a powerful question upon us regarding the preservation of truth.
Consider the irony. A historian working against the clock, fighting physical decline, compiling a record that he knows is flawed. When does the pursuit of completeness, the polishing of every detail, become secondary to the absolute necessity of capturing the raw, immediate truth before it vanishes forever? Is history most valuable when it is immaculate or when it is simply present?
That is the provocative thought we leave you with today. Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, when we think about the history of a place, especially a small town like Fountain Hill, Arkansas, we often picture something static.
Right. A monument, a building, a date carved in stone.
Exactly. But the source material we have today, and we're talking about everything from ledgers and rail timetables to these amazing community scrapbooks, it tells a completely different story.
It really does.
The story of this place isn't static at all. It's defined by constant restless motion, by the energy of people and goods and ideas all passing through.
And that's the real thesis of this deep dive, isn't it? Our sources are full of these data points that, in the surface, they just look like dry administrative records.
Yeah, boring stuff.
Totally. But when you follow the line of movement, when you trace the routes of travel, you realize this community was less a single geographic spot and more of a junction.
The crossroads.
The crossroads, exactly. So our mission today is to trace that momentum from the very first founding trails, literally paths worn into the wilderness, all the way to the final whistle of the railroad era.
And through that, we can understand how transportation, how the simple act of moving, shaped every single part of life there.
And it really does start right at the beginning, with the founder himself.
Isaac Denson. The man was he was movement personified. Our sources introduce him as this figure of constant relocation. He was born way back in 1794 in North Carolina.
And he wasn't just a farmer. The sources are specific. He was a prosperous and energetic farmer.
And he had this fantastic frontier nickname, the Hustler.
The Hustler. That says everything, doesn't it? It tells you all you need to know about the kind of drive you needed to survive and really thrive on the edge of the American frontier back then.
For sure.
His whole life was a series of these big, ambitious, pretty risky moves. First, he goes from North Carolina to Mississippi.
Okay.
And then, when he's already 48 years old, which is not young for that era, in 1842, he moves again, this time to what the sources call the Great Wilderness of Arkansas.
Wow. So he wasn't a young man looking for a fresh start. He was established.
He was. And he didn't go alone. He arrived with his brother, Thomas C. Denson. And by 1850, that move had clearly paid off because the source says the community was populated by a veritable passel of Densons.
A passel of Densons. I love that. So his movement wasn't random, it was strategic. He picked a spot that wasn't just good for farming.
Exactly. It was all about location, 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 even then. The survival of the community depended entirely on its connectivity.
Right.
In the 1840s, the community's location was defined by being at a strategic crossroads. Specifically, it was on the Louisiana Trace.
And these were the main arteries of the time, the trails leading from the Mississippi River out west.
It was basically an early, very rough-hewn transit hub. It was linking these major migration paths long before anyone even thought about laying down railroad ties.
And this established a certain rhythm of travel, right? The speed of a horse-drawn wagon, maybe an ox cart, that was the benchmark.
It was a cultural benchmark for decades.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating is the immediate conflict that you see in the records when the new technology, the railroad, arrives.
Yeah.
It tries to impose this faster, louder, mechanical pace on the old sort of organic rhythm of life.
It's a literal friction. The sources have these wonderful, though kind of alarming, recollections from the early settlers.
They do.
They talk about how the local train would frequently cause teams of horses to get frightened.
You could just picture it.
Oh yeah, the sources are specific. It led to runaways, it led to damaged equipment, and pretty alarmingly, it led to sprained ankles.
That image just gives you the stark choice the community was facing. The old way of getting around horsepower. It was part of the landscape. It was slow, sure, but it was manageable.
Right, integrated.
But the locomotive, it was alien, it was loud, it was inherently disruptive. It wasn't just faster. It was this force of nature that clashed directly with how people and animals had learned to exist in that space.
And that initial, very literal collision really foreshadowed the massive economic and social disruption the railroad was about to bring.
It did. But before the trains completely took over, Fountain Hill had already become important enough just from its crossroads location to be named the first Ashley County seat. That was in 1848.
And that early civic life, it was all tied directly to Isaac Denson's personal infrastructure.
hmm The state legislature formally designated Isaac Denson's house as the courthouse.
Hmm.
So county court, circuit court, it all happened inside his home.
And for this service, for letting the county use his private residence as the center of local justice, Denson was paid. What was it?
The tiny sum of $5 per session?
$5 per session. We have to pause on that. I mean, today you couldn't even rent a chair in a meeting room for $5.
Not for an hour, let alone a whole session.
What does that tell you? It shows that in those early days of statehood, the line between private property and public utility was just super thin. Civic duty was often valued more than personal profit.
Especially by a guy they call the hustler, who was already doing pretty well for himself.
Right.
It also tells you about how rudimentary those sessions must have been. The sources have this truly fantastic anecdote from those early courthouse days that illustrates the unhurried, almost pastoral pace of justice.
Oh, this is the woodpecker story.
This is the woodpecker story.
Yeah.
So one afternoon, an attorney is making this really elaborate, long-winded argument, and the presiding judge, a Judge Willis, gets completely distracted.
Not by noise, but by nature. The Denson house had this broad porch extending its entire length in front, around which was a railing, and right there in the yard was a mulberry tree full of ripe fruit.
And the judge just becomes totally absorbed in watching this red-headed woodpecker. He watches it grab a berry, fly over to the railing to rest, and then carry the berry to an old pine snag.
The source says he completely forgot court, advocate, and all surroundings.
Just gone. Lost in the moment. So when the attorney finally finishes his big speech, the judge has to sheepishly ask him to repeat the entire thing.
And the judge's reaction is just perfect. He turns to the sheriff and says, "Mr. Sheriff, take a gun and kill that D.D. woodpecker. It interrupts this court."
Right.
That frustration, that sudden imposition of modern impatience onto the slow, natural rhythm of life, that's exactly what the railroads were about to do on a massive scale.
A powerful image. That woodpecker was the old pace, and the locomotive. It was the new.
So let's pivot from that era of ox carts and frustrated judges to what the sources call the golden era of the rails. Fountain Hill quickly went from being that simple crossroads to a true railroad town.
And this wasn't just a single track running through. This was a complex, interconnected network. We're talking about the Crossett Railway Company, the AL&G.
Which had like a dozen different names, right? Depending on the
So
year.
it was a whole alphabet soup. The Arkansas, Louisiana, and Gulf,
Yeah.
the Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, the Arkansas, Louisiana, Missouri.
That confusion sort of underscores how sprawling and maybe a little financially unstable these early regional railroads could be.
Exactly. But the one line that really provided the consistent, reliable pulse of the community for generations was the Ashley, Drew, and Northern.
Everyone just called it the AD&N.
The AD&N.
And when we talk about longevity, we really mean it. The AD&N basically became the town clock for Fountain Hill, starting in 1913, and it ran all the way until 1996.
83 years.
83 years. It ran a predictable daily train, 80 miles round trip, connecting the major hubs of Crossett and Monticello. Just think about the impact of that continuity on people's lives, how they scheduled business, social visits, farm deliveries.
It creates this foundational rhythm that structures everything else. The fact that the railroad was affectionately known as the all-day and night line.
Or sometimes the Ashley, Drew, and Nobody line, depending on who you ask.
Right, depending on who you ask. But it speaks to its constant presence. And that daily routine was necessary because of the sheer volume and the variety of goods that were flowing in and out. It defined the town's entire economic life.
This wasn't just bulk transport either. The cargo lists in the sources give you this incredibly detailed look at what sustained life and drove the economy there.
Okay, so on the agricultural side, what are we seeing?
They shipped out cash crops like cottonseed, tomatoes, and onions. The list is so specific, you can see exactly what local farmers were betting on for their income.
But the real backbone, without a doubt, was timber. The railroads were basically built to serve the forestry industry.
Absolutely. The catalog of timber products shipped out of Fountain Hill is an industrial inventory in itself. We're talking piling, poles, cross ties, pulpwood, chemical wood, lumber, handle blanks, stave bolts, and saw logs.
The specialization is what's so striking.
Yeah.
They weren't just shipping wood, they were shipping specific components for construction and industry all over the country.
And to handle that volume, they had to invent specialized technology. The sources note that the really heavy saw logs were carried on a special train with cars built specifically for that purpose.
And this is where it gets really interesting technically. they mention a steam-powered top loader.
Yes, the top loader.
This was a critical piece of early 20th century logging tech.
Yeah.
Before this, loading these massive logs onto rail cars was just back-breaking, dangerous work. You're doing it by hand or with really basic cable systems.
Right.
But the steam-powered top loader could mechanically lift and arrange the logs. And crucially, the sources say it could traverse the length of the train to stack the load evenly.
Which means you're maximizing the capacity of every single car. You're cutting down loading time.
And in the railroad business, that means you're saving a massive amount of money.
It's that kind of technical detail that shows you how specialized and how capital-intensive this local industry really was.
And it wasn't just the big stuff. The sources even mention a couple of smaller, stranger things being shipped out.
A limited amount of sand.
And, surprisingly, mussel shells.
Mussel shells. I wonder what they were for. Buttons, maybe?
Could be. But it shows that every single scrap of the region's economic output, no matter how weird or small, it relied on those tracks.
And if we look behind the cargo itself, we can see the immense cost it took just to build this thing. The sources let us zoom in on the granular economics of building the ALNG, which started in 1907.
And this documentation really helps you understand the true scale of what it took to connect a town like Fountain Hill to the rest of the country.
The initial expenses are like a little time capsule of early corporate logistics. The very first expense recorded was just $10.03.
It wasn't for rails or spikes or labor.
No, it was for 23 telegrams sent in May 1907.
And those telegrams went everywhere. It shows you the geographic scope of this project. They went to cities all over Arkansas, Hamburg, Pine Bluff, Little Rock, but also to Missouri, Kentucky, New York, Ohio, Tennessee, Texas, Louisiana.
So this small local railroad required national coordination just to get off the ground.
Absolutely. You're communicating with suppliers, with financiers, with partners all across the country at the same time.
And once the project got going, they had to set up basic infrastructure for the hundreds of workers who were building the line. We can see the living conditions from the general manager's office budget in Monroe.
It was furnished with things that today just seem impossibly cheap. Sheets for 45 cents.
Pillowcases for 17.5 cents.
And the towels for 12.5 cents.
Wow.
And while management was getting set up, the workers out in the construction camps needed food. The grocery lists for the engineers and laborers give you this fascinating insight into early 20th century nutrition for heavy labor.
Okay, what were they eating?
It starts with 25 pounds of prunes at 8.5 cents a pound.
Prunes. Makes sense for camp life, I guess.
Right. And dry navy beans at 4 cents a pound and flour for $2.90 a barrel.
Prunes and navy beans. That's a very practical diet.
Right.
The prunes for digestive health in rough conditions, and the navy beans for cheap, dense protein. You need that if you're laying track all day.
It shows a highly practical, if maybe a little austere, approach to keeping your labor force healthy and effective.
But this industrial progress, this efficiency, it came with a real documented cost, not just in dollars, but in life.
The ALNG financial records track this violence with a kind of disturbing, meticulous detail. They place the value of animal and human life right next to inventory costs.
The company was constantly assessing its liability. In 1908, they paid out $207 for damages caused by the trains.
And the list of casualties is specific. 2 mules, 1 colt, 2 heifers, and 2 sows.
The railroad was just moving too fast for the existing pace of farm life. It was inevitable that livestock would be killed.
And sometimes, the cost was tragically human. The sources detail a payment made in 1909, $167.25 for the burial of an engineer, C.W. McDaniel. He was killed in a wreck at a place called Caney Switch.
Wait, they itemized his burial costs in the company ledger?
You did. That level of detail speaks volumes about liability and accountability back then. They record $125 for the casket.
Okay.
And then separately, $16.25 for the robe and underwear.
Wow. That's a chilling detail, to see the specific, intimate costs associated with burying a man who was killed by the very engine of progress he was driving.
It just underscores that the construction of this network, the foundation of Fountain Hill's entire economy, was paid for not just in investment in timber, but in the highly specific, itemized cost of life and death on the tracks.
That focus on cost and value, moving from the tragic death of the engineer to the immense effort required to build the system, It leads us right to the concept of economic failure.
Hmm.
The rails carried everything from the highest value timber to, as the sources call them, the most worthless shipments. This was in the late 1920s.
This is the infamous cabbage tragedy.
It is. So farmers in the region had invested a huge amount of time, labor, and money into what they hoped would be a really profitable cabbage crop. And the harvest was incredible. It was bountiful.
So far, so good.
Right. But the timing was just awful. The market value was so depressed, probably due to oversupply or maybe the early rumblings of the Great Depression, that the profits were, and this is the quote, less than nil.
Less than nil. So not only did they not make money,
They lost money. After shipping their entire crop by rail, the farmers didn't just get a check for $0. They were actually billed for freight due.
oh, that is just devastating.
Isn't it? The value of their entire harvest had not paid the freight to ship it?
Just think about the emotional and economic blow of that. You work all season, you get this huge harvest, you load it onto the train, the symbol of commerce, and you get a debt notice in return.
It must have cemented this deep suspicion in the community about relying on national markets and the whims of rail costs.
It would have to.
And in direct, almost ironic contrast to the worthless cabbage, the source identifies what the community considered its most priceless cargo.
And it wasn't gold or anything like that.
No, it was a non-paying passenger who the residents were most concerned about.
This is a story that reveals so much about the social pressures and dependencies the rail system created. This passenger was someone struggling with a legitimate drug addiction.
Probably to opium or morphine, which were available by prescription then, but were heavily regulated.
Right. And this individual used the predictable daily schedule of the train to manage their habit. They rode between two key towns.
The passenger would buy their initial allotted dose in Fountain Hill. Then they'd hop the daily 80 train to Monticello, which was the bigger hub.
And in Monticello, they would hit as many drugstores as time allowed before their return trip.
And they'd attempt one more purchase when they got back to Fountain Hill.
So the tracks, which were meant for commerce, were inadvertently providing this critical logistical support for a private struggle.
Sure.
And the community's concern shows that while the railroad brought prosperity, it also imported and facilitated these social challenges that required movement between towns.
The rails were also essential for facilitating movement at the very end of life. We have these incredible details about the logistics of moving the deceased when the roads failed.
Which was a constant problem in rural Arkansas, especially in the winter. The mud made roads just impassable.
The sources recount this really poignant example, the tragic death of a log hauler named W.T. Stewart in 1909.
He was killed instantly when a tree fell on him during a storm. But the movement didn't end with his death. In fact, the logistics headache was just beginning.
Exactly. After Stewart's death, his ox team and wagon, which were very valuable, were held by a Dr. Russell, ostensibly for medical services rendered before death.
And the railroad gets involved because they have a business interest in the movement of this equipment.
The complexity of liability meant the railroad had to step in to retrieve it. They paid a man named Dow Key, who was a watchman on their payroll, $1 a day for 6 days to go and retrieve one specific injured animal,
The cripple ox named Bell.
the cripple ox Bell. And they didn't just retrieve her. The company shipped meal and hauls from Bastrop to Oliver specifically to fatten Bell up for market.
That's an unbelievable amount of administrative effort and expense. Paying a man for 6 days, shipping fee, all for one single injured ox.
It just speaks to how valuable draft animals were in 1909 and the meticulous care the railroad took to minimize their losses, right down to a limping ox named Bell.
And beyond the economic and the logistical, the tracks were also implicitly linked to civic life, to politics, to legal drama, because these figures had to move between Fountain Hill and the county seat.
You see that in the contested 1916 sheriff election between John C. Riley and a Dr. W.M. Chavis. This was a brutal political fight.
The sources detail that the contention was so severe that John Riley's own father, James Nathaniel Riley, ended up on the Central Committee that was tasked with investigating the irregularities of the vote.
Must have been an awkward situation.
A little bit. But after weeks of scrutiny, after throwing out all the illegal votes they could find, they finalized the count. And Dr. Chavis, far from losing ground, actually gained 25 votes and was declared the winner.
But the investigation dug up a much deeper issue, didn't it, about civic responsibility?
It did. The widespread practice of poll tax evasion. The committee found that a significant number of men were not paying the mandatory $1 annual poll tax.
And this detail is so important for understanding the social contract of the era. That poll tax wasn't just a hurdle to voting. That $1 a year was specifically earmarked to support the free school system.
Right. And the sources note that discovering this widespread avoidance really discouraged the committee member. He realized that citizens were knowingly undermining what was arguably one of the best government systems in the region public education.
It connects individual choice directly to a community consequence. By avoiding that $1 of movement into the public coffers, they were slowing the momentum of social progress for the kids in the area.
And this was compounded by actual violence and high legal drama. You see it in the story of the local bank cashier.
That would be Dr. M.L. Smith, the cashier of the Fountain Hill Bank. He became a material witness in a really high-profile murder case.
The Vincent Hollis case concerning the Thurman killing.
And the bank cashier held immense social power. His position put him right at the center of the town's life. And now, it's crime drama.
Things escalated very quickly. Dr. Smith was later indicted himself. It's a little unclear for what exactly, but probably related to the case. And as a result, he left his employment with the bank and secretly fled the state.
So he just vanished.
He vanished. Subpoenas were issued, but they all came back marked non est, which is Latin for he is not to be found.
A legal designation for someone who's absconded. But that movement couldn't last forever.
No. He was eventually spotted back in Fountain Hill by a Constable High, and he tried to run.
But the constable managed to outrun him and place him under arrest.
And despite this dramatic chase and his flight from the state, the case was eventually considered closed, and Smith just returned to the county and quietly resumed his medical practice in Crossett.
The whole incident highlights just how vital that bank cashier position was in a small-town economy.
The sources tell us he was a true one-man infrastructure. He acted as the teller, loan officer, bookkeeper, janitor, public relations officer.
And this is the most provocative part, the local arms merchant.
Right. That list is the definition of power in a frontier community. He holds all the financial strings, he controls credit, he cleans the place, and critically, he facilitates the acquisition of weapons.
So when a man with that much influence suddenly moves, the entire local economy feels the ripple effect.
Absolutely. But the rhythm of movement through Fountain Hill wasn't always about local commerce or legal drama. Sometimes it was the launch pad for these grand, life-changing migrations that span the entire continent.
So now we move from local logistics to Western ambition, and we have to focus on the Sparks family.
John Sparks is the prime example here. He only lived in Fountain Hill until he was 14 years old. But that early experience planted his seed of ambition that led him to follow the great Western movement of the era. He joined an ox cart migration to Texas.
He's a genuine frontier success story. His ambition and his willingness to embrace that movement eventually transformed him into a massive cattle king operating out of Nevada and later California.
At his peak, he owned 70,000 head of cattle at one time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just massive wealth built entirely on the movement of livestock.
But his career also perfectly illustrates the high-stakes, volatile nature of that life. He lost 35,000 head of stock, half his fortune, in the brutal winter of 1889-90.
A devastating loss.
That kind of loss would bankrupt most people, but he recovered, he relocated again, and eventually he got into politics in Nevada and became governor.
What stands out, though, when you analyze this movement is the motivation behind the family's initial decision to leave Arkansas for Texas.
Right. Popular culture says, "Go west, young man," this romantic call to adventure.
But the sources suggest a much more powerful personal and emotional reason for the Sparks family.
We have a letter that gives us the real impetus. It was written in 1856 by John's 17-year-old brother, Martin Van Buren Sparks, who was a teacher at the Fountain Hill Academy. And he wrote back home, grounding the idea of this huge move in his mother's deep personal longing.
Martin wrote that their mother, Sarah Deal Sparks, wants to see you so bad that at times it appears she will make us get ready and go to Texas anyway.
Wow. So the entire massive ox cart journey, the dislocation, the risk, it was undertaken simply to see her daughter, Elizabeth, who had gone there by ox cart a few years earlier.
Movement driven not by economic theory or ambition, but by overwhelming family ties and maternal longing.
It makes the whole thing so much more human. But
Yeah.
we have to pivot now from voluntary movement to movement that was anything but.
Yeah.
Fountain Hill's local infrastructure became connected to global conflict and was leveraged for forced migration during World War II. This is the painful story of the Denson camp, part of the larger Jerome Relocation Center.
The scale of the government's acquisition of land to build this camp was staggering. It completely changed the landscape. The U.S. government bought 14,622 acres for $100,000.
And to put that number in context for you, the listener, the sources show that $100,000 was an amount a non-farm worker in 1939 would have taken more than 98 years to earn.
98 years. It was an immense, sudden injection of capital, all to facilitate confinement.
This site was designed to house Japanese Americans who were being forcibly removed from their homes. The Jerome Denson Relocation Center received over 6,700 internees.
And critically, the sources make it clear that the vast majority of these people, 60 to 70%, were American citizens, forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast or who had volunteered to move from Hawaii, choosing this difficult option over other forms of confinement.
Life inside the camp was defined by this hastily built, austere infrastructure. The internees were housed in low tar paper barracks covered entirely in black tar paper.
Just the bare minimum for mass housing.
And yet, even in that confinement, the resilience of the community shines through in how they adapted the shared infrastructure. High school students, for example, had to use Block 33's dining hall as their study or assembly room during the week.
And that multi-use space continued into the weekend. When school wasn't in session, that same dining hall was sometimes used for a funeral service by the Buddhist population in the camp.
And then on Sundays, it served as the meeting place for the Denson Church, which was composed of Protestants of many denominations.
So it's a single space that had to house education, meals, death rites, and worship, all under these conditions of forced relocation.
And the local transportation network was essential to keeping this massive, confined population alive. The same rail lines that carried timber and cabbage now had a new mission tied directly to the war.
The sources confirmed that coal for the camp was shipped in by rail to keep the facilities heated and operating.
The history of the camp is also layered with this deep post-war irony, which further shows the rapid, pragmatic movement of infrastructure to serve new needs.
After the Battle of the Bulge in Europe, German and Italian prisoners of war were moved into a nearby camp facility.
But the ultimate absurdity, noted by the sources, is that those POW barracks facilities built to confine enemy soldiers were later repurposed and used to house American GIs and their families.
Who were attending the nearby Arkansas A&M College in Monticello.
Right, so you have this relentless, non-sentimental reuse of infrastructure built for war and confinement, immediately shifting to serve education and the homecoming of veterans.
And while these grand forces like railroads and global conflicts drove massive movement, we also have to recognize how individual resilience continued that spirit of motion during the hardest times.
Often using very modest personal infrastructure. This brings us to the Great Depression and the story of Holt C. Hobbs.
He was known across the entire region as the Candyman.
Holt Hobbs is this perfect example of entrepreneurship born of necessity. He was later drafted into the Navy during World War II at the pretty old age of 36, but his real service to the community came earlier. During the Depression, when movement was restricted by poverty and bad roads, Hobbs built a whole business around his car.
He essentially mobilized his inventory. He turned his car, probably an old T model or something similar, into a Walmart on wheels. He traveled door to door across this isolated rural area selling penny candy and household goods.
His daughter vividly recalled how critical his service was. She noted that his customers didn't have transportation, they depended on him for household goods.
So he was more than a traveling salesman. He was a lifeline. He is using his personal infrastructure to bridge the gap left by the slow economy and the isolation of the rural landscape.
And he was pretty sophisticated in his business model, too. He created premiums to ensure loyalty, like offering 3 yards of dress material to regular customers.
His logistics were impressive for a one-man operation. Boxes of candy and goods were shipped directly to him from Memphis, and he turned his private car into this critical mobile distribution center.
That same hustle, that necessary movement, you also find it in the intense effort it took to document all this history before it just vanished.
Even the process of historical preservation in Fountain Hill required this significant, sometimes dangerous physical movement against the decay of memory.
The historian who was compiling the community scrapbook faced huge challenges, compounded by their own health struggles with multiple sclerosis. They had to rely heavily on community help just to physically secure the records.
And this led to a truly tangible act of historical retrieval that's described in the sources.
They quote a man named Leroy Deckelman and his act of preservation. He scaled the walls of the school building to retrieve lists of graduate names.
while the historian held the ladder.
Right. It's such a powerful, literal metaphor for capturing history before the physical infrastructure, the school itself, disappeared completely.
They were literally scaling disintegrating architecture just to pull names from the walls.
Yeah.
The constant struggle to consolidate records, finding yearbooks that were cut, torn, scribbled on, and were in very poor condition. It underscores that historical record-keeping is often not this passive scholarly thing.
No, it's a physical, labor-intensive movement against entropy. It's a fight to preserve the legacy of motion and life.
But inevitably, all movement, even the most consistent, eventually slows and then stops. We have to conclude our deep dive by acknowledging the end of that constant pulse that defined Fountain Hill for more than 80 years.
The Ashley, Drew, and Northern, the all-day and night line, it ran its daily 80-mile service so faithfully from 1913. But the Enger finally went silent.
The source indicates that the AD&N ran its last scheduled service on June 29th, 1996.
The last train to enter Fountain Hill that day marked the definitive end of that particular essential daily rhythm in the community's life. The age of the rail, which had completely transformed the town, was finally over.
So what does this all mean for us today? How do we synthesize these centuries of relentless movement?
Well, looking back across all this material, it's just so clear that Fountain Hill's identity is intrinsically linked to momentum and flow.
We've seen Isaac Denson, the hustler, making his founding migration. We've seen the Sparks family following ox carts to Texas, driven by maternal love.
The steam locomotives hauling cotton, timber, and, worthless cabbage.
The necessity of the rail for forced relocation during a war. And finally, Holt Hobbs using his T-model to provide this localized lifeline during the Depression.
The value of these incredibly granular details, the $5 cost for Denson's house as a courthouse, the 17.5 cents for a pillowcase at a rail camp, is that they move the narrative beyond abstract dates.
Exactly. What looks like a boring series of ledger entries or rail spikes is actually the documented struggle, the constant movement, and the sheer logistical effort of people just trying to find a better life or survive a collapse or connect with family.
Infrastructure, whether it's a dirt trail or an iron track, it really does shape destiny.
This deep dive shows that to truly understand a place, you have to understand not just where it is on a map, but who passed through it, how they traveled, and why that specific means of transport was so necessary.
It reminds us that every structure we rely on today is just the current version of a path that was laid by movement centuries ago.
And we'll leave you with this final, thought-provoking analogy that we pulled from the sources. The history of Fountain Hill is a lot like the story of the Flat Creek Baptist Church,
which was founded way back in 1845. The church itself moved its location in 1922 and changed its name in 1948, so it had its own organizational movement over time.
Right, but the church's original site was described as being on a lonely dirt road that was once a main highway, but now only a trail on a woodsman's map.
It forces us to consider that same movement in our own lives. Which of the main highways, the technological platforms, or the infrastructure paths that you rely on absolutely today, the ones that define your current momentum, your daily route, your means of communication?
Which of those will be regarded as nothing more than a mere trail on a woodsman's map 150 years from now?
That's the rhythm of the ridge. We'll see you next time.